Hey everyone, it's Eric. I wanted to talk with you a little bit more about the game that we played in Dallas, the Super Jena scenario from the La Bataille de Prusse 1806. A couple of things that were interesting. One, the reason we selected that particular scenario is we knew that we were going to have 3 players on each side, and we wanted a battle where everyone had something they could do and use right from the start. So a number of the different battles that have been published over the years have reinforcements coming in, or have units coming in, or have some sort of delayed approach that would leave some of the players twiddling their thumbs, waiting for their command to come on the board. So we figured this one would be great. Everyone would have a lot to play with right from the start, and we didn't have to necessarily wait for anything to happen before someone had a unit or segments of a command to use. Then the other interesting challenge we had was adapting the scenario to the 5th edition rules. So Tom and I had played a 5th edition rules at a play test in Consim last year in 2019, using the what was it? I think it was the Mont Saint Jean scenario, playtesting that for Ed Wimble, and we really liked it. 5th edition rules worked really well, and had lots of really good features, and so we wanted to then use that same set of rules for the Super Jena game. And so because the Super Jena was a Marshal Enterprises publication, their rules don't necessarily have anything in them with sophisticated types of command control. And so what we did was we had to kind of figure out what we were going to do regarding that. Fortunately, on the labataille.us website, some of the gentlemen there had put together some publications and some information to try to help adapt some of those scenarios to like the Regs 30 or Marie Louise that have that kind of command points and maneuver unit structure. So we looked at that for both the Jena scenarios as well as the ones for Auerstadt, which of course was an older publication, but used similar forces and similar commanders. And so once we were able to do that, we were able to get a sense of who, which side was going to have command points for which commanders and how to set things up. Now, one of the things that we did in order to help obscure placing maneuver units on the board was that Tom came up with basically a list of all the different divisions or corps or elements thereof that might be awarded a maneuver unit, and that was on a separate piece of paper. And at the beginning of each turn during the command segment, the French would go into a separate room, and they would pore over a map and allocate their command points accordingly. Pretty easy for them. They tended to have lots of command points, and so they had plenty of command points to basically spread all around and keep everybody engaged. For the Prussians, usually we had 3 or 4 command points to kind of play with, and as a result we had to be pretty judicious about where we put those. A lot of times we would use the command points to create an administrative march to reallocate a division from, say, our right wing, which was not being engaged, over towards the center or over towards the left where it might be of better use. And so even though we didn't have very many command points to use, we always felt like we had enough to do what we needed to. A lot of times, because the Prussians are on the defense, once they had their lines set, it was just a matter of letting the French come up to them and getting engaged. If we needed command points, it was usually for when we were doing a series of counterattacks maybe, or trying to shore up a line, or bring in another division to back up one that was getting pounded. And so we were able to get by fairly well with relatively about half as many command points as the French. Now, even though the Prussians had basically everything there, it wasn't going to be enough to stop the French. The French, of course, have units with better morale, typically, for both their infantry and their cavalry, and of course they have tons of artillery. Everything they've got is a lot more mobile than the Prussian forces, and so therefore we kind of knew the Prussians were going to be in a tight spot. With the scenario, there's two options that are presented. One would be to fight a withdraw from the battlefield, so basically a fighting retreat, whereby you'd have your divisions there. They would fight for a while, and then by 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, start to exit off the map on the road to Weimar or Opoldo. Basically, the idea being you would get victory points then for every division that was more or less attacked that you were able to extricate from the battlefield. The other option was to basically fight to the death, where the Prussians are trying to inflict the maximum amount of damage to the French as can be done. Now, because we knew we had a finite amount of time to play the scenario, we opted for the kill as many French as you humanly can. And so in that particular case, for every French increment lost, whether it's cavalry, infantry, or artillery, it counts as 3 victory points for the Prussians, while every dead Prussian increment only counts as 1 victory point for the French. And there are a few victory points here and there for capturing geographic locations. And so part of our goal with the Prussians was to stay and fight and try to hurt the French as much as we could. And to that end, while the Prussian infantry is a little bit unreliable and certainly brittle, the Prussian cavalry is absolutely amazing. There were units there that could just, go screaming across the board and destroy vast quantities of French. And by doing some charges early and often, we threw the French players off balance such that they slowed their approach considerably. So obviously, capturing Marshal was huge. That threw the command situation, into turmoil with his corps. But it also made a number of the other players very cautious with their approach coming up towards the French, where they would form square at the end of their movement, change out of square, run forward a few hexes, change back into square, so that way they would avoid the fate that had befallen elements of Ney's command. And so in that regard, it certainly helped, because if that wasn't an option, or those cavalry weren't very strong or had weak morale ratings, there's no game at all. So it was a real balancing act, using those cavalry. Typically we put them behind the infantry line, so that way if there was a break in the line, we could use them to charge and counterattack into the French, as well as keeping them where if the French tried to get around our flanks, we could then strike back in some regard, or counter them in some way. The French certainly have more cavalry than the Prussians, but the Prussians have got some terrific units, and that made a big difference.